Hello there. I'm 1 minute late. I apologize. The computer was not cooperating, and someone's mowing the lawn outside. So, sorry for the noise if you can hear it. Maybe you can't. Maybe you can hear the music? Unclear. Hi, it's me, Scott, and this is our millionth stream. I think this is the 8th kind of official residency stream. And today, for kind of a focused topic, I want to talk a little bit about making things, like making objects and what it takes to make an object and what that process is. Because I think we've been talking a whole lot about computer stuff and software techniques and hardware techniques. I'm putting my phone over here so it's less distracting. Get over there. And haven't talked so much about building objects yet. And we did a little bit of technical drawing one day trying to figure that out, but I want to talk a little bit about it kind of in terms of the basics. In fact, so basic that we're not even talking about specific fabrication techniques or specific materials. But I want to talk about kind of, to me, what a high-level approach is to going from, oh, I have an idea for a thing, to getting that thing. Because I think a lot of people get discouraged when you see an object, when you see something like a thing that exists, this thing, or this thing, whatever these things are. Like, you look at it and you're like, well, this was made in a factory, and I could never make anything like this. How could you possibly make a thing like this? Who knows? And that's of course for complicated electronic things, but even things that are relatively simple. I don't have any of those things within reach, but we'll look at them. Like this thing. Who made this thing? How did we make this thing? How did someone decide to make this, and what did they do, and what was their process? And so I think partially I just want to do this a little bit to expose you to some ideas of how to go about making things and some different kinds of materials and processes you can try. So, as usual, I'm poorly prepared, or like kind of prepared, where I just typed out a bunch of notes, and then we'll talk about those notes and find typos in them, and also just look at some examples. So let's start with the most important part of the whole stream, which is picking the wallpaper. Oh, that's a pretty good one right off the bat. But I feel like I don't want to go with the first one. We're still using Norwegian wallpaper. I like this one. I like this nice Norwegian wallpaper. In some misty mountains. So many of our Norwegian wallpapers seem snowy. Okay, so I called this building basics, and maybe that's misleading, because again, I don't want to talk about how to hold a hammer, or what size screw to use, or things like that. Because I think there's some abstract ideas, both in what the process is, or higher level ideas, both in what the process can be, and in dealing with materials and fabrication. Because those are kind of two things that play a major. The relationship of these two things is very important when it's time to make an object. So I'm going to talk about, I call this the process. I probably should say that it's my process or a process, because there's a million ways to make things. But I tried to sort of break this down into what I felt like were the basics on how to make something, how to make an artwork, how to make a project. And with kind of an added bonus one that's maybe or bonus step that's easy to forget. So the place you start is the ideas. And I put big ideas within constraints, because I think actually the constraints part is crucial. And for me is one of the most important parts of making a thing is like, well, because if it's just, okay, time to make a thing, it's like, where do I start? What am I making? A helicopter? A rowboat? A microwave oven? I mean, like, I have no constraints here. Like, what kind of thing do I need? And if you're working with a client or working on a design type project, you usually get a lot of constraints provided to you. Like, well, this is going to go on a billboard and it's this size. So your constraint is to fit something in this size, and you have to show this picture of this person drinking Pepsi, whatever. Not a great example because it's very advertising-y. forget the advertising part. Let's just say like, oh, you need to do something that fits in this size, or make something that works well in this environment. Like maybe, oh, we need you to make something to go outside. And then suddenly it's like, okay, well, that means it has to be weather resistant and made of materials that will hold up to the sun. And oh, it gets dark outside at night, so maybe we have to light it. Like suddenly once you have some constraints, you get more clarity about what a project is. Now with art projects, sometimes you really kind of have no constraints. You might have inherited constraints in that, okay, I happen to be good at these kinds of things. So, oh, you want me to make an art project? Well, I happen to be good at making things out of whatever, silicone sculptures. That's not true, but it's just an example. I'm not. And so that's a constraint that you can apply right away, just to say like, well, I'm going to use what my skills are to do this, and I'm a metal worker. And so that's what this is. That's a constraint here. Those constraints are helpful. I mean, I think constraints are good. People might view constraints as a bad thing or as limitations, but in my mind, when you start with the whole wide world of possibilities, which is where you should start in concept development, I think. You want big ideas, but you got to start to kind of constrain those things. And really, the whole process, to some extent, is a process of constraint, because you're starting with something in your head that has infinite possibilities, and then that gets narrower and narrower and narrower, and then at the end you have something that exists. So, and speaking of that, in terms of like the big ideas in your head, I think everybody has something that they're just kind of thinking about, or that they're kind of interested in, even if they don't actually know it. They're kind of subconsciously focused on something. And I think that sometimes for me, a helpful thing is to sort of reflect on that. Like, well, what am I drawn to right now? What are ideas or problems that are interesting to me? What are, so for me, for example, for this residency project, it's very much become radial symmetry is a thing that I'm just finding myself interested in and very drawn to. And why is symmetry beautiful? And why do we like it? And what are the mathematical implications, and what are the biological implications of symmetry? So I have sort of this concept that is driving a lot of what I'm doing is symmetry. So once you have that idea, I think a common misunderstanding about how artists work, especially artists who make complicated objects, is that, okay, that artist just has their idea on Monday, and then on Tuesday they make it and they're finished. And that's just, I almost never see that. I mean, there's certain artists whose that's their thing, is to just sort of show up, and then they'll draw in a certain style and cover a whole room, or they'll paint things in a certain way, or improvisationally do something. And that's of course very valid, but it's not my process, and it's not really the process I'm talking about here. I'm talking about things that are complicated to the point that you probably wouldn't, it might not even be possible to do that. To say like, well, I have an idea for whatever, like the microwave oven or the helicopter. Like, I have an idea for a helicopter. I'm gonna make a helicopter today. It's like, you're probably not gonna make a helicopter today. You're probably gonna spend time like figuring out, well, what are the materials, and what's the machinery, and what's the motor, and all of, I mean, it's gonna be a process that takes time to do that. And so between this, the kind of like, let's make it phase and the let's think of it phase, is I put 2 steps, and this is misleading also, because really this is a very fluid process and it can kind of go back and forth sometimes. Also, for certain kinds of static work, you might not actually need prototypes, but I put that here too, because it's important to the kinds of work that I do. And if humans are going to use a thing, I think it's important to do. So the point of this phase is to, before you're ready to build the final thing, probably the ideas in your head are kind of vague and they're kind of nebulous. Like me. Oh, I'm interested in radial symmetry. What am I going to do with it? Well, I'm going through this kind of phase right now where I'm like, well, let me try this, or let me experiment with this, and let me see what this looks like. And let me try this technique and see if I like it as an approach. And so you've been watching me do that on stream. kind of bounce back and forth between these phases where, oh, okay, I'll maybe do a drawing or do a sketch and then let's figure out how to make that thing. Or maybe I kind of, in some cases, have been sort of jumping straight from concept to prototype because they have to do with software techniques or things like that. Or in some cases, the drawings, like the super formula or something like that was provided to me. Something I want to point out in here is this is not a new thing. Like this, if you go to Renaissance art and you look at the art of Michelangelo, it's easy now to look at those artworks and just be astounded and be like, oh my gosh, this is incredible. Michelangelo just picked up a chisel, picked up a brush and made this happen. And that's just not true. It's in fact, there's a Michelangelo quote that I really like. We'll never find it. And of course, you know, quotes are questionable, but who knows? But this, I've heard this quote enough that I like it. If people knew how hard I worked to get my mastery, it wouldn't seem so wonderful at all. And I think sometimes Michelangelo is very humble in his writings, and sometimes he's very not humble in his writing. But I think the point there is, it's work. And so even in the Renaissance, it's time to build a building, or it's time to build some complicated component of an interior chapel, or paint paintings or sculptures. There was a concept called the modello, and it's a model, essentially. So in art, the modello is sort of in some ways it's the design drawing of like, this is what it's going to be. In some cases, it's the proof of concept. This Lorenzo Ghiberti, this modello, he did this one panel, and I believe that's how he won the commission to do the doors for the Florence Baptistry. This is a later painting, but it's of Michelangelo presenting a small model of St. Peter's. This is an oil sketch. So sometimes they're physical things. So this is a model, like it's a scale model of a large building, right? In some ways, this is just a piece of something. It's almost like a prototype. It's sort of Ghiberti saying like, well, if you give me this commission, I can do these full doors. Let me see the whole doors. They're pretty amazing. Yeah. So he did one of these, and then now he got the commission to do the whole thing. And similarly with this, or it might be, this is a sketch, an oil sketch. There's another name for that, schizo. I probably pronounced that incorrectly. But as a way to say like, okay, this is the painting I'm going to do. This is a 69 by 55 centimeter sketch for this altarpiece that was 16 feet high, 5 meters high. So it's preparatory work. And in fact, the word cartoon comes from this era. It's named for the paper it was on. So when Michelangelo was ready to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling, he didn't just get up there and slap paint on. He did drawings of all of the images called cartoons that are sort of like preparatory drawings, and then those were transferred to the ceiling, I believe, and that's what he painted. So understand this process is an old one, and it does a few things. Like this scale model lets you solve lots of problems, but at a smaller size. It lets you show other people, kind of sell them on the idea. Like it's a useful thing. This sort of, I might call this now something like a prototype, to say like, okay, I can do this one piece of it. I've proven that I can do the whole thing. You know, this is sort of a proof of concept, is another term that you hear used in this realm. Also, especially for things like architectural drawings, it's not just about the idea or the concept. It's about the technique and the labor and the approach. And so sometimes these drawings, you've probably heard the term concept art. So sometimes these drawings are concept drawings, just to say like, well, I think it could look like this. That's different from what you might call technical drawings, which technical drawings are like, hey, it's not just gonna look like this, this is how you make it. So just as an example of that, last week we did some work in Fusion 360, which I'm learning, I'm learning this, so I'm definitely not a pro, to look at what's it like to make these technical drawings using a tool that's made for that. It's called CAD software, computer aided design, I think. Technical drawings might not technically be the right term, but I think it's pretty close. Hopefully you get the idea. It's a drawing that is basically instructions on how something will be made. So if I look at this, for example, our kiosk, maybe? Sure. So this is the final object we ended up with, right? This is our object. And so from a certain standpoint, you can be like, oh, this is a nice concept drawing. In fact, we even did some renders. Well, it doesn't help if it's actually showing the drawing. It's kind of breaking my point that I'm trying to make. Anyway, so you could see this as actually, is it here? Maybe this is the one we want. Yes, okay. So I did some renders of this that were kind of like, sort of like concept art. Like, okay, this is what this thing could look like. But there's more to it than that, because the instructions on how to make all of these things, almost, are all included here. So if we go back to this kiosk and we look at this side panel somewhere, one of these drawings, all the dimensions, all the instructions on how to make that thing are right here. So a fabricator could look at this and be like, okay, I see, it's this tall and it's this wide, and okay, this part is this big, this diameter is, okay, I get it. So someone could look at this drawing and make it. Also, what's cool, and what I'm designing this for, a computer aided process, like a CNC router, computer controlled router could look at something based on this drawing and make this thing for me. So the point I'm trying to make is that sometimes drawings are just about getting an idea across or exploring an idea, and sometimes they're for you. You know, by drawing, you kind of are thinking on paper, but sometimes they are very literally instructions on how to make something. So that's key. And then that prototyping phase. So the prototyping phase is both helps you prove a concept to say like, okay, I can do this. Like, I wanted to make this weird thing and I wasn't exactly sure it was going to work, but I tried this and it's going to work. And it's not the final version. You know, maybe it's made of aluminum foil and cardboard, which I've definitely made prototypes out of aluminum foil and cardboard. But once you've done that and you can say like, okay, this is going to work, and you might have to do that a few times, you've validated the idea in the real world. And that's especially important if other people are going to touch it or use it. You know, is it tall enough? Is it durable enough? Whatever. You want to know those things before you spend a lot of time and money making the final thing. And I will say, in all of these processes, I have them written as kind of a 1, 2, 3 step by step. That's not really true. Like, design and prototyping, I think very often go back and forth between each other. And sometimes you may get to this point and try a few things out, and you have to say like, you know what, this just isn't working. I actually need to go back a little further. Very frequently you'll do something here and then you'll go back here and make refinements. But sometimes you've got to, if you've heard the expression back to the drawing board, that's this. If you try it and it's like, it doesn't quite work, I got to go back to the drawing board. So once you've gone through that process and you've figured out what you're making and you've done all the drawings and you've validated everything, you've done all the prototyping and testing, it's time to put it together and build it. And it's funny because I called this building basics, but it's probably the part I'm going to be most vague about because it's such an enormously huge topic. So we'll talk a little bit about it because for me, a lot of what fabrication, what this build it stage is a lot about the relationship between materials and fabrication processes. Like, what is this thing made of? Because certain materials are going to want you to use them in certain ways, or are going to require special considerations. So it's very common. You know, we talked about constraints up here. The nature of the materials that you use are a constraint. And the nature of the materials you use will require certain fabrication processes, certain techniques, certain tools. And that's kind of true in an inverted way also. Like, certain techniques and certain tools work best with certain materials. So if your constraint is the material, you may have to use a certain process. If your constraint is the process, you may have to use a certain material. And then I added this at the end because it's so easy to forget. It's easy to forget for me. I'm still bad at this, and I've been trying to be good at it for more than 10 years, but I'm still bad at it, is documentation, documenting the project. And in the world we live in now, where one of the upsides and downsides of the very connected, very socially internet connected world we live in is, you know, I can make a nice object and some people can see it and they can enjoy it, but it's many fewer people than could see it and could enjoy it if it were shared in some way through my documentation. So if it goes into my portfolio or goes into a magazine or goes wherever. But so I think it's good to document, obviously. If you're making art, you're hopefully documenting the work at the end with photographs, etc. But I think it's good to document all these phases as much as you can. I think it is good and useful to try to, that's what I've been trying to do with the studies I've been producing, is document these two processes, is have some documentation to say, like, this is what I was doing during this time. So, and just take some pride and joy in the things you make and want to capture them, even if it's just for you to look back on them later. Okay, this is such a tremendously huge topic that it's almost foolish of me to tackle. But I just want to talk about some ideas because I think sometimes it's not, maybe these are obvious, but I feel like sometimes they're not obvious. And what I want to talk about really is I want to talk about the materials you can use and then sort of how you will use them to make things and kind of what does that really mean? That's funny. I thought that would add okay, well, my formatting's all wrong. So a lot of times when you think of materials, you might think of them in two categories. And this is very reductive, but it's just as to give me a way to talk about it. So there's kind of these traditional construction materials, like when it's like, okay, it's time to make an object. What is that object going to be made of? It's going to live in the world and people are going to use it. You might think of things that are construction materials that are used to make big things. And those things are like wood and metal and plastic and concrete, things that buildings are made of. But not just buildings, like this table. This table is made of wood and metal and maybe a little bit of plastic. And this microphone stand is made of metal and plastic. And this microphone is metal and plastic. And so there's these rigid materials. And these categories are a little fuzzy, things you go back and forth. There's also, so those kinds of materials exist in the world and they want to be used in a certain way, right? There's also what I've just called here, and this is very fuzzy, obviously, traditional craft materials. And I put things like paper, things like fabric, things like glass. Now, you could call glass a construction material, and it is all the time. You could call wood a craft material. So these are not rigid categories. Like if you're gonna sit down and like hand carve a nice small piece of wood, that's more craft than construction, right? So I'm not being rigid about that. I just wanted to give some broad categories to think about because I think different people will be drawn to these categories for different reasons. Like, you know, when you think of what craft materials are, often you can work at them in a non-specialized space or at a small scale or at an intimate scale. I can sew something by hand. I can, maybe glass is, I was thinking of things like small stained glass projects. Obviously glass could be up here. But, or blown glass or something like that, like a craft, making a small craft object, maybe like ceramic, you know, you might think of pottery. But again, these are not rigid because of course there's ceramic and construction. These are maybe ridiculous categories, but I hope you see what the distinction is. Versus these materials are more like, well, I've got to go out to the shop, you know, and I've got to use big power tools and whatever. So those are not rigid, but I just, when it's time to make objects, especially if it's like the thing I'm making, like, oh, it's time to make something for the museum, like a big fixture. These are kind of the materials you think of. But I like these materials too, and I would like to consider ways to involve these materials as well. These are the materials that you are potentially shaping yourself in kind of the way I'm thinking of this. But very often when that happens, you're still using a lot of off-the-shelf parts. So much of the stuff we make at the museum is a combination of kind of these categories, but in particular, maybe these categories where, okay, I'm gonna figure out what the wood is shaped like and how it fits together and all of those things, and we're gonna make that. But, excuse me, we're not gonna design every screw or every bolt, you know, we're gonna buy that stuff off the shelf. But really the point that I wanna make in talking about all of these is that the fabrication methods are often dictated by materials. So if I'm thinking of like, well, I want to do mold making. It's like, well, you're probably not going to do, you could mold some metal, you could melt some metal, you could mold some plastic, you could mold some concrete. You're probably not going to mold wood. You could probably mold glass. Molding fabric, maybe. Like, but it just as an example. Or if I say, oh, I want to use a lathe and I want to mill something. It's like, well, you know, a lathe might be good for certain kinds of wood and certain kinds of metal, and it could be good for plastics. I don't know that you'd use a lathe or a power saw or whatever, like heavy machinery to work on paper necessarily. Maybe there's some interesting thing you do where you make some solid block of paper with resin or epoxy, and then you're going to machine it. So like using big power tools and machinery to work on something, like you'd work on wood and metal. Or if you're working with, sometimes if it's handheld things, a needle and thread, or it's scissors and an X-Acto knife and tape. Well, maybe you're working with fabric, or maybe you're working with paper. So just, these are, I feel like I've done a poor job in arranging these, but hopefully I'm making the point here is that the way you make something is very much informed by what it is made of, and vice versa. What something is made of is going to inform how it's made. And if you're a person who doesn't really consider yourself a craftsperson or an artist or a maker or whatever, maybe you just haven't quite found the medium you like. Maybe the medium is is kind of what I want to say here. You know, maybe it's like, oh, I don't like working with wood. The sawdust makes me sneeze. I don't like it. Or like metal makes me nervous. You have to get it so hot to melt it, and machining metal seems too dangerous. But like maybe you can make something out of paper or fabric or glass or whatever. So just there's, I guess the 2 points I want to make. One is that this is a tremendously huge world, and it scales up certainly to huge industrial scales where you're building skyscrapers. But many of these things can be done just at your home, in your garage, at your kitchen table. So I guess I just want to point that out a little bit. And then one thing I want to add to that is digital fabrication, which is not super new, but some aspects of it are new in terms of how available it is to people. Digital fabrication offers a lot of new possibilities. And when I'm talking about digital fabrication, I'm talking specifically, it's huge. It's a huge realm. But I'm talking, at least for today's purposes, about laser cutters, which you may be familiar with, 3D printers, and CNC routers. So They kind of do different things in different ways. I'm not going to go into detail about them because there's a million resources. Just watch some YouTube videos about them. But like, laser cutters are great at precision cutting thin materials. There's also plasma cutters and water cutters and other kinds of cutters. But basically, you've got a bunch of paths and you're going to have some sort of computer software setup, control the machine that's going to cut those paths. And you can make beautiful objects like this. You can make parts for objects to assemble. And of course, you probably don't have a laser cutter in your garage, but it's becoming more possible to have access to one, whether it's at a school or maybe at the museum, or even with companies online that will do it for you. Same thing with 3D printers. 3D printers work a little differently. Usually, there's a lot of different kinds, but the sort of consumer kind is usually extrusion based, where it's almost like hot glue, sort of, where this little printer head is going to go around and it's going to, almost like it's printing, but it's going to also move up as it does and make a sculpture. And so you can make, of course, amazing things out of 3D printing. You can also make parts for things out of 3D printing. There's also CNC routers, which are very much like laser cutters, but are kind of like at a different scale, because often laser cutters, at least the ones I use, tend to be a little smaller for thinner materials. CNC routers can be, and this isn't always true, I'm just saying what's kind of typically available, but they're very good for things like, throw on a sheet of plywood and cut some shapes out of it, which is probably what I would do with those Autodesk 360 drawings, Fusion 360 drawings we were just looking at. So having said all of that, I kind of want to look at it a little bit. And maybe this is weird, but, well, we can look at it in some of my work, certainly, and just kind of go through and talk about some techniques of some different things that I've made in the past. Like, this was a really early laser cutter project I did. Here's some like cloth, textile sorts of things incorporated into a project. Here's paper, here's vegetables. Here's some other sort of cloth and textile kinds of projects. This is made of paper. This used a water jet cutter. This used a laser cutter. Like, on and on. As you go through these places where I've made objects, in many cases, this one's a little silly because I didn't know what I was doing yet, and I didn't actually know how to make circuits, so it's just like artwork that's pretending to be circuitry. But it was my first time using a laser cutter. It was a long time ago now, 10 years. But it was fun. You can sort of do drawings with a laser cutter. You can kind of like etch things out with a laser cutter to create shapes. Also, later I got into cutting parts from a laser cutter. So these objects were made by cutting all of these flat parts. And this is wood. This is all wood. Cutting flat parts on a laser cutter and then designing them in such a way that they can be assembled into a volume. So that's another fabrication technique that I like, is kind of working in 2D, but with the awareness that you will be building those into 3D. I know, Draclin, this is like my last one. This is my last science and tech stream. And then it's over. We're done with this. It's a place for nerds. No, I'm thinking of switching to streaming and art, but this one is, since this really is like a fabrication talk, I am still doing it here. But I'm thinking tomorrow I'm going to make the switch. So yeah, this was laser cut, and the idea was to design 2D objects that then could be assembled into 3D objects, which is how these two sculptures work. And so, just to talk a little bit more about that process, what I did was draw drawings, and this time using Adobe Illustrator, just two-dimensional drawings, and then I was able to send those drawings to a laser cutter and have it cut out these pieces. And you know what's a bummer? Somewhere I have the drawings of my idea for this. Like, when I was thinking about, well, how do I make this thing? How does it fit together? What does it all look like? I drew those drawings. I don't know where they are. I need to find them and put them on the site, because I think that's useful documentation now. That would be cool to see. Like, what were the pieces of this that went into making this 3D sculpture? Because it's a fun thing to do. These were fabric. We already talked about this project not long ago and how little I knew what I was doing, but it's mainly soft materials. This was an early project I did, kind of first learning about interactive projects, and it's made of paper. So it's a circuitry project, but really all it is paper, some foam, some aluminum foil, and some copper tape, and like some extremely simple circuitry. And even this little slider is made out of paper. I made it as you slid it across, it would kind of change the color of this. So don't underestimate paper. I think paper is a pretty amazing material to work with, and especially to prototype with. We've looked at these before, but it was kind of a very traditional woodworking project in some ways, like this enclosure. I think I made it out of poplar. What did I make this thing out of? Yeah, poplar. So it was a pretty hard wood. And all of this was cut, I say by hand. I used power tools, but when I say it was handmade, it means I didn't use digital fabrication. Is cardboard paper? Usually. Yes, sometimes. Cardboard is also a great fabrication material. There are Coroplast is kind of like cardboard that's not made of paper. It has a different name. It's made of plastic. It's just corrugated plastic instead of corrugated paper. But it's a fun, cool material as well. These guys were cut on, it's called mounting board. It's like a cardboard, a non-corrugated cardboard sort of. It's a really thick kind of card material, and these were all laser cut after being procedurally generating the paths. I also cut them out of wood, which is a nice thing about some of those digital processes, is they can adapt to the materials. Although in this case, the wood had to be very thin. The wood it had to be thin enough for the laser cutter that I had available. And I had built a tool that would kind of automatically make the drawings for me. Does this still work? It does. It is so out of date, the newest phone. Oh, there's an iPhone 5 in here. There's an iPad mini in here. But the idea was that you could kind of play with these parameters. It's my sort of first parametric design project. Play with these parameters to create different profiles and cut them on the laser cutter. On this project, I did that routing. I did that on a table router. So that was also kind of a hand detail. It's a routing bit with a certain profile that I just ran around the edge to give that detail. And I would do that. I built this a long time ago. I think I'm a little better at fabrication now. I would have definitely done some things differently. Also, I did probably a little too much of this on the fly, or kind of figured it out as I went. And some parts were pretty ridiculous. Like all of these speaker holes, I drilled those individually by hand with a drill press. But I probably think it came out pretty well. It's a pretty pleasing project. This project had some fabric components and connected with buttons and some paper and plastic. Anyway, just to show you some materials. But we already looked at this a couple of weeks ago with the water jet cutter and lots of traditional craft, just hand making the cabinetry. But what I actually want to look at, and maybe this is weird, but I want to look at Neil's project. So the previous digital artist in residence, what is it called? Technologist in residence, Neil Mendoza, who does incredible work. Everything he makes is amazing. And his project, unfortunately, hasn't been seen by very many people because the museum closed very shortly after. Unfortunately, we had to close the museum. So kind of no one has actually seen it yet, or very few people have actually seen it. So I'm excited for the world to see it. But what is really special about Neil's project in terms of everything we're talking about fabrication-wise is he used so many fabrication techniques in one project. And so I just wanted to kind of look at his pictures, and hopefully he won't be mad at me, but just talk a little bit about his process because it's pretty amazing. So from the very beginning, Neil was pretty interested and fixated on, it's real bread, fixated on birds. And so he was making bird feeders and capturing footage of birds and kind of wanted to make an artwork for birds, if I remember correctly. And then over time, he began exploring all these other possibilities of sort of, well, what if making birds and controlling birds. And I think he had some that were made of paper before we talk about the bread. I can't find it. I can't find the paper birds. Anyway, maybe we'll find them as we click through stuff. Because I think it was useful to see that too, and see that he was very flexible with his materials, particularly in the prototyping phase. So the way this works is there's this huge flock of mechanical birds that go up of a stairwell in Museum Lab, and they can be controlled individually, and their bodies and wings are controlled by little DC motors. And Neil has software that controls them all, and it's pretty amazing. But I just want to talk about it from a fabrication standpoint, because when you look up here, there's a lot of complexity. There's a lot of stuff going on, and digital fabrication really, I think, kind of made this possible, because it would have been crazy to try to do all this stuff by hand, because it was a lot of work even by hand. And here's like Neil's custom circuit boards. So is this the place to look? Where do we want to look? So one of the things, just speaking of materials, you're not limited to the materials that I listed before. Of course, you can make things out of anyway. Make something out of anything, basically. And Neil he decided to use bread. You know, I used beets for the beatbox. Neil wanted to make these birds out of bread. But even in his prototyping, he used interesting processes. Like this is a silicone mold. So mold making is another interesting fabrication technique, where he made this silicone mold, stuck bread in it, and then baked it, and it let him have bread in the shape of the mold. I think these birds were made in that way. So at first he was baking his own bread and making birds that were sort of bread, based on hand-designed birds, custom bread loaves, or these they tried these very intricate sort of hand bird sculptures that were very nice. But ultimately, I think he decided that if there's going to be 50 of these birds, it's just too much to try to hand sculpt them individually. So he needed a process to make them quickly. So he decided to use, this was one of the mold ones, but he decided to use just off-the-shelf bread and cut up the bread. And then he sealed it in some way. I'm not sure, he used some kind of epoxy or some kind of resin to seal it so it wouldn't rot, because of course food is going to rot. And ended up with something like this. I'm not sure if this is the completely final model, but it's close to what the final model is. And something I want to point out about this is just on this model, you have this interesting choice to use bread as a material, which is awesome. But you also have these little objects here, these little connectors. Neil 3D printed those. So he could have 3D printed some sort of interesting bird shape, but of course the bread was a more intriguing approach. But he did leverage 3D printing to make these connectors. So even if you are like me and you're a little skeptical about 3D printing in terms of how nice the objects it makes look, 3D printing is still pretty amazing as a way to make connectors, custom connectors for things. That's true. That's very possible. You could be concerned about food waste here. I don't know what how he would respond to that. I don't know that came up. I think the idea was that these birds were made of bread and they were the prey of all of the birds outside, and the birds outside wanted to eat them. So these birds are afraid of the real birds, I think was the narrative that he was working on. So that's just the birds. He has some kind of custom hardware to connect to them and some 3D printed hardware. I think those maybe weren't, I'm not sure if that was the final design, but at least the little wing connectors were. And just looking at this, we can see he did custom PCB design, which we made use some of, which is really just a kind of technical drawing. You do a kind of technical drawing, and then either you or an outside company can make it into a printed circuit board. You can see here he has all these parts made of acrylic, these boxes made of acrylic, and those are all drawings that he did that they were laser cut and assembled. You can see using this whatever you call this, extruded aluminum strut, which is sometimes a nice way to make temporary or permanent enclosures, cages to mount on. So that those were kind of off-the-shelf materials that then he mounted his custom materials to. You can see, yeah, you have lots of machining process using the lathe here, lots of like hand drilling work that PJ's doing here. Marissa and Jeremy doing other kinds of installation, fabrication kind of work. I'm looking for some more. Yeah, so these are all of those acrylic boxes, plus some off-the-shelf parts that went with them. So the acrylic boxes were custom, but these are off-the-shelf motors, off-the-shelf connectors, off-the-shelf rods. So it became a combination of available parts and custom built. And there's one more piece that I wanted to show, just one more element to this. It's this frame. This frame is CNC routed. So that means every one of these birds and every one of these bird mounted objects. I wish there was a slightly better picture. It's a little tough because the museum had to close before the documentation was fully finalized. But every one of these, where's a good one? That's a pretty good one. Every one of these pieces, even the pulleys are laser cut, is a combination. This is CNC routed. This is laser cut. The connectors on top of the birds, these joints, are 3D printed. There's off-the-shelf parts. There was hand fabrication work to create some of the parts, certainly to create the birds themselves. So I think this is a pretty amazing project to talk about in this context. There's the paper bird I was thinking of. Paper's cool. Recommend paper because it leverages so many things. There's so many materials. There's bread, there's wood, there's acrylic, there's twisted metal wire, there's other metal connectors and components. It uses so many fabrication techniques. There's hand fabrication, there's baking, there's laser cutting, there's CNC routing, there's 3D printing. So Neil is especially amazing to the point that makes me a little jealous. I'm a little jealous at kind of combining all of those different strategies and techniques to make something. So this is it's a lovely project. I'm very excited for the museum to reopen so Neil can finish and have like his perfect final documentation. Not quite there yet, but all the process documentation is really nice. So having said all of that, I want to give you just some idea of where to start. And it can be daunting with a lot of this because you maybe don't have a laser cutter or a 3D printer. Maybe you don't even have a saw or any tools. So I did want to talk about just some places to start. So one, I did want to call out again, paper's pretty awesome. And you can make cool things out of paper. You can obviously make origami, excuse me. You can spell it wrong too. Folded paper designs. There's also paper craft, which is more like, this is what I think of when I think of paper craft, like again, this is a 2D, 3D kind of thing, but where you do a 2D design and then print it and fold it. And so it can be fun, even if you are intimidated by creating your own designs. If you just download some of these papercraft templates and print them, you can make these yourself. Like these are very achievable things that you can do. So I definitely encourage you to look into that. If you're interested in digital fabrication, I'm going to change the order of this a little bit. That was the wrong button. That button. That's not the URL anyway. And you don't feel like you have easy access to things like 3D printers or laser cutters or CNC routers or whatever. I think it can be, sometimes you might be surprised. Maybe you have access through your school, or maybe you have access through a library or museum might have be able to give you access to that. There's sometimes little make shops or like maker spaces in cities that can give you access to that. But I did also want to point out that there's online places where you can make an object, you make it on your computer, it's digital fabrication, and you upload it to them and they will print it and they will mail it to you. So sometimes it can be a little expensive, sometimes it can be not so bad. I thought they had a shop where you could just see other people's stuff. Let's see. Is that a different site now? Okay, it is. You can have your own shop. I might even have a shop. Do I have a shop? That doesn't look anything like me. I feel like, actually, weirdly, just suddenly had a flashback that I may have uploaded something here, and now I don't remember what it was. Anyway, so my friend and collaborator David Lobser has his little shop. So these are little models, 3D models that he did that then he uploaded, and Shapeways will print them. So he can have like a little mini store that all these interesting parametric models that he makes, you can buy them and he gets some of the money, or he can have them sent to him. So yeah, he's got from his cool moth project. So this is like, they have a marketplace where you can sell things based on your designs. There's lots of amazing jewelry made that way in particular. Lots of really interesting 3D printed jewelry. Unfortunately, it gets a little expensive depending on the materials you use, but I just want you to know that that's an option. Like, even if you don't have access to these tools, you can do the drawings and do the work and upload it. There's another site called Pinocchio. Shapeways is good for 3D printing. I think you still exist. Yeah, Pinocchio is good for laser cuts. So you can upload stuff to Pinocchio, and you can kind of pick the materials that you like and the materials that you're interested in, and they'll do all the cuts and they'll mail them to you. So I might end up using Pinocchio for some stuff just because I like all their materials. So Pinocchio is a good one. Let's add that to the list. And I'm sure there's a million others that can do laser cuts for you, 3D prints for you. Once you start to get into things like CNC routing and stuff like that, you kind of bump up to industrial scales maybe, but that stuff's out there. There's places online, for example, like PCB fabrication. I don't have those PCBs in front of me. You can design those and then upload them to a site. OSH Park is a cool one, where you design a circuit board, they will print it, and then they will mail it to you, which is cool. So I guess my point is, with digital fabrication, you don't necessarily have to have access to the tools. I also just want to give a shout out to YouTube. I feel like half of the things I know how to make, I know because of YouTube. I grew up watching shows like New Yankee Workshop. Let's see, let me find Norm. And I just love watching people make things, and I especially like Norm Abrams because he's awesome. So I've watched, I don't know how many hours of video of old PBS shows of extremely talented craftspeople making things. So Norm's making something incredible here, I'm sure. Is he building a table saw station? Awesome. Oh, does it fold down? Amazing. Norm, I love it. So I love to watch those things. Of course, there's tons of contemporary people that post their fabrication processes. And then one other site I want to give a shout out to is Instructables, because I think it's a good place both for, so Instructables is largely just people, individuals designing things and then posting the instructions on how to make them. And some of them are really complicated and use pretty crazy fabrication processes. Some of them are dead simple. Looks like this one uses laser cut MDF and an Arduino. So if you want to make things, but you don't necessarily feel like you have ideas for what you want to make, but you want to learn stuff, it can be awesome to just look around at these Instructables projects and say like, well, that seems cool. I think I want to make this. I want to make this cool clock. And you can read the instructions and learn how to make it, and then you can make it. So this one uses 3D printing. Yeah, so these little pieces are 3D printed. Looks like it probably uses some laser cut, some cutting, some off-the-shelf parts, and on and on. But there's also stuff that's not real techy. There's like artwork and cardboard. So here's a whole section on stuff made out of cardboard. Are those shoes made of cardboard? I don't think so. So they can be pretty simple craft projects too. They don't have to be tremendously technical or complicated. Look at this cardboard robot hand. Cool. So I think this is a great site. One, just to give you ideas, just to be inspired by and see the amazing things people make. And two, to teach you how to make this stuff, to like help you learn the tools and techniques that you need to make this stuff. I think this site is uniquely good at that. Birds of Way. I think Birds of Way is okay. I don't know. I have to think on that. What's the best pun? What's the best pun for Neil's art? Okay, so that is mainly what I wanted to talk about today. I just wanted to give you an idea. In fact, we probably could have just looked at Instructables from the start. But just give you an idea on, if you're interested in making things, you can start right now. You can start with just some paper and some scissors. Like it doesn't have to be more complicated than that. In fact, people make astonishingly beautiful things out of just paper. Like gorgeous things out of paper. And very often these things are totally made by hand. Not always, but very often. This is hand cut, like beautiful hand cut paper sculptures. And you can make boxes and volumes like we looked at with the paper craft. Paper art doesn't have to just be flat. So just something to keep in mind. Okay, so that is, what does Jacqueline say? No, I get it for sure. So speaking about Adam Savage, yeah, Adam Savage is awesome to watch make those things. But I guess that's what I want to get away from a little bit, is the idea of you watch someone make something and then it's like, well, I could never make that. I don't have this insane set of tools. Like, how am I going to do this? So I think there's ways to start on that early. And yes, you also bring up one of the most important points. It's really hard to pick up things later in life. And I would say the biggest reason for that is adults don't like to be bad at things. Like our culture is very unforgiving which is tragic, of adults being bad at things. If you've watched me on stream, I'm bad at things every day. And that is something I really try to cultivate. I really try to, because you cannot be, what's the amazingly important quote by Jake the dog? Ah, yes. Sucking at something is the first step to being sort of good at something. And that's true. That's just true. Like, there's so few cases where you're just going to sit down and be good at the first thing you do. So one of the biggest challenges isn't about tools, and it's not about techniques, and it's not about materials, and it's not about any of that. It's about patience with yourself and being gentle with yourself and allowing yourself to make mistakes and still enjoy it. Because if you just get frustrated trying to learn something, how are you ever going to learn anything new? So I think that's super important. And yeah, I definitely understand it. When you watch these people on YouTube or PBS or whatever making things, and they've got all the tools, like sometimes the tool makes the thing. Like sometimes you can't do the thing without the tool. But that's not often true. Like, even if you have a tremendously amazing workshop and you can make okay, imagine a person that has an incredible workshop. They have every tool you could possibly imagine. You can probably make that stuff too with like $100 worth of power tools. It'll be harder. It might not be as refined, but if you've got like a drill and you've got maybe a jigsaw, then like maybe a circular saw too, maybe you just use your jigsaw. But if you have like a drill and a saw, you can make stuff out of wood. Like, it shouldn't be that complicated. And if you've got scissors and a piece of paper, you can start making those papercraft models. So I want people to feel like they can make stuff. I want people to be able to look at something and understand how it was made. And that's hard. In the world we're in now, it's hard because we have so much of this stuff. So much of this stuff that is just like, yes, it's nice industrial design, but it's like, aliens could have made it. Robots could have made it. Robots maybe did make it. It almost has no connection to the idea that a human could make it. And you can make stuff that looks like that. The processes can be a little complicated, but you can. Or you can be like, well, what can I make? And what's interesting and what do I enjoy? And I think that Instructables is a good one about that. Yeah, you're right. Like those, that's that thing again. That's that Michelangelo quote. Let's just look at it. Because I think it's so important. Because unfortunately, so often that so it's funny because Michelangelo, on the one hand, will talk like this and be kind of humble, and then other times he'll talk about how he's the greatest of all. So it's a little inconsistent. But the thing here is if you only see the result, or you only see the hyper sped up YouTube clip of somebody making something amazing, and maybe they didn't show all the mistakes they made, or how many hours they took, or how many tries it took. That's what used to do used to do that well, I think, was old skateboarding videos with the bloopers. And you'd see that, okay, this person did this amazing trick, that if you just see that trick out of context, it's like, that's the most amazing thing I've ever seen. No human could ever do that. But if you see like, oh, actually this person tried it 700 times and they only got it on their 800th try. Like, that's the real world. That's how things really work. If you've been watching me on these streams for the last few weeks, I mean, certainly there are people who work more fluidly than I do, but you've watched me make mistakes and get frustrated and start over, and like, that's okay. I'm trying to be honest about the process, because it's not always the cleanest process. And yeah, maybe at the end I'll have like some really nice photos and it'll look slick, I hope, and work well, I hope. But the process is a little messy. And even if someone's amazing and they can do something right in front of your face in real time and have it be amazing, those people exist, but they only got there probably because of thousands of hours of work. Yeah, I mean, it's funny. You see that in the skateboarding videos, but I feel like you don't see it a lot in like art. So often you see the final artwork and you don't see the process. I mean, I actually think it's nice to say, just to see Neil's process, because there's some missteps in here. I don't think that he showed any like major disasters, but just to see like, oh, his prototypes, like the birds, he went through a lot of iterations to get the birds where he liked them. Like, look at that bird. Look at this one. Look at this bird. Weird flat bird with an eyeball. He spent time and effort, and it wasn't easy. Like, he had to build this thing. He had to build this special bird mold to try to make the custom bird shapes. And those custom bird shapes look cool, but in the end, he didn't use them. So it's which I think is, of course, is great. It's part of the process, but it's like, that's a place where he had to go like maybe a little bit back to the drawing board. And that's part of creative work. Bob Ross is good for that too, except he's a little... You've never once seen Bob Ross not finish a painting, right? You've never seen a Bob Ross like halfway through an episode be like, you know what? I screwed this up and I can't fix it. It's not salvageable. It's like there have to have been times, maybe early in his life, where Bob Ross just screwed up. He like messed it up, or he like abandoned it because it wasn't very good. You know, that's, I like Bob Ross's attitude about mistakes, but his mistakes are, he or at least he figured out how to incorporate them. Yeah, I think he always did, actually. I believe he always did 2 versions of every painting. I believe that's true, that he did like an off-camera one and then repainted it, which makes sense. Like maybe it'd be bad television. Like what is he supposed to do if halfway through the episode he's like, I don't like this. I do that basically every week where I'm like, I don't like this. I don't think it's very good. Okay, so that's an hour. That's kind of what I wanted to talk about today. I was very long-winded. I am going to take a short break and get a drink of water, and then let's figure out some work to do today. So I will be right back. Excuse me, please. Okay, so actually, topical. That idea of the struggle, of the mistakes and the missteps, there's another Michelangelo reference that I really, really like. That is, in some ways, the only thing that keeps me trying to make art, because it's so hard for me. I don't know what it is. It's just so hard. It's hard. Maybe I shouldn't do it. It's hard. Is this sonnet that he sent his friend about painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling. And so, like I said, Michelangelo is a little inconsistent because sometimes he'll talk about how he's the greatest. Sometimes he'll be very humble. But this one I really like. So he wrote this to his buddy, to Giovanni da Pistoia. And I've seen different translations about it, but the gist of it, so Michelangelo, by some accounts, did not really like painting or consider himself a painter, but it's what the Pope wanted him to do and commissioned him to do. So like Michelangelo was, my understanding, much more into sculpture and appreciated sculpture more. But, you know, sometimes he had to do what he had to do. And the painting of the Sistine ceiling was like, it's enormously huge and it's so detailed and meticulous. And so he's up there on scaffold, like trying to paint on the ceiling, and it sounds like the most miserable thing. So not only is he talking about how awful it is and how much it hurts his body and how like unpleasant it is. And my favorite one is where he talks about how it hurts his butt. Maybe this isn't the right. There's some translation where it specifically talks, maybe it's about his haunches, but basically he talks about, it hurts my neck, it hurts my butt, like I hate it. And then he talks about he's stuck like this and he's like losing his mind a little bit. And he's just like going a little crazy. But then he basically says like, my painting is dead. I'm not in the right place. I'm not a painter. Like, one of the seminal, like one of the greatest artworks of all time by many metrics. Like if you asked any art historian to list great art accomplishments, the Sistine Chapel ceiling is likely to be on it. And he's up there miserable, like uncomfortable, feeling bad about it, feeling like he's a bad painter, feel like I get a lot of hope from this, because even if Michelangelo felt like this, it gives me a little bit of hope. Well, the inconsistency, I'd have to think about what the quotes are, but the inconsistency is sometimes he points out that I had to work really hard for this. But sometimes he seems to imply more like I'm magical, like I'm a genius. But sometimes that's what's a little bit inconsistent. So sometimes he leans onto like, I'm just like you, but I can do this only because I work hard. And sometimes it feels a little like he leans on, I'm special, I'm singular. Now, having said that, I don't speak Italian, and I have not read any of this in anything other than translation. And quotes like this are mistranslated or misattributed all the time. So that's just my impression. I like it better when he feels more realistic about it. Sometimes he's talking about like genius and inspiration, and it feels a little lofty and removed from when he's talking about like, this is hard work. I like it when he talks about this is hard work. Now, again, I'm definitely not an expert. I've not read the Italian source material. So anyway, I relate to this often, and I drive myself crazy on projects. Just last night, just probably too much information, but I spent hours, basically just paced around this apartment for hours thinking that I was not liking where some aspects of the residency project were going. And the two biggest problems I was having was, kind of coming to accept that just in the museum lab space, there's just not a good place to do large projections, that's fine. That's a reasonable constraint. But it meant I couldn't do a large projection. It also was starting to feel more and more like the 3D that I was trying to force to look good on the looking glass. Also wasn't feeling great, and that I wasn't enjoying that as much either. And so it was sort of like, well, if that goes away and isn't a looking glass, excuse me, that means you're just going to go up and you're going to do a thing on a screen, and then it's going to appear on a screen. And that just felt so not magical. Like it really felt like I'm missing an opportunity here, especially because also, to be honest with you, it's been kind of fun to do the studies, like to do those 3D studies. But when I really look at what I think it would take to do things in the way that I've been thinking with the 3D geometry generation and all of that stuff, like I feel like it would be a lot of work for me to build those tools, and that the results, I don't know, would feel like they were worth it. Like I would do a ton of work, and I'm not entirely convinced that the results would justify that amount of work for that particular tool set, because it's almost like I'm building my own specialized 3D modeling application to make these shapes. Now, if I don't use the looking glass, it's a little different, but it is still a specialized 3D mesh creation system, maybe. So I'm not decided on any of that, but I was having a moment last night where I was kind of thinking like, well, there's aspects of this that I still really like. I really like this world of radial symmetry we're in. I like the magic, like even when we did this silly little thing where it was like, you start with, you can't see this silly little exercise. That was like, you draw a thing, one slice of it on tracing paper, and then you just trace it multiple times and you get something else. And I think there's something really interesting about that, where the repetition and the radial symmetry kind of create, you really can't see this at all. Anyway, you saw me do it on another stream. But that there's something magical to that. There's just like something new emerges magically from that repetition. So I've been thinking really hard about like, well, what can I do with this process so it doesn't feel like it's just a bunch of screens, because that's not what I want to. That's not what I want to make. I don't want to make things that are just a bunch of screens. I don't want to make things that you could just as easily do at home on an iPad. Like, then kind of what's the point? Why don't I just make an iPad app? I want something that feels a little more special, a little more different. So I started thinking a lot about that. I also started thinking, like, well, there's some of the studies I really like. Like, I really like the superformula study and the other one. The spherical harmonics study, I think turned out nicely as well. And so I was thinking almost like, well, what if I actually decided to do two pieces here? Because there's some things that I'm liking with the 3D geometry that are sort of incompatible with the authoring idea, where visitors are making their own creations. So why not make two things? So I mean, you know, this was just me thinking last night, and I did sleep on it, and I've been thinking more about it, and I have some ideas on it. So maybe one thing we just try is, maybe we try this today. Let me think about what's the best way to do it. So here's the thing. And here's where it's tricky, is I've been imagining, like, well, what is a physical version of this? How can we do this as a physical activity? This authoring stage. If we're going to have people make something that is reminiscent of those Victorian diatom artworks. And I have an idea. My fear is that it's going to feel a little bit too much like a kaleidoscope. And there's already lots of good kaleidoscope projects, and I don't feel like I need to make another kaleidoscope project. In fact, the museum has one that's fun already. So I'm a little worried about that. But the thing I liked about that tracing paper exercise is that something new is revealed through the repetition. Like, you do your little thing, and then the outcome is presented to you, and it's like, oh, there's just something different. Something different happened here with this repetition. So I'm interested in creating that. So I was thinking of a camera-based project with maybe a little bit of computer vision. And so the question becomes, how do we prototype that? We barely started on that yesterday, and I kind of had to end a little early. To get on a call. But yeah, so I mean, so basically what I'm kind of imagining is this, is there's some kind of surface presented to you. It might be a TV with a piece of acrylic over it. And that surface has a camera above it, and that surface prompts you to do some things. Like, you're prompted to do some activities on it with physical objects, like arranging physical objects maybe. And then when you're ready, or when it's time, you push the button, and then a thing happens. The repetition happens. So it's a separate step, like, and something is revealed to you then. And I was imagining even like, oh, it'd be kind of cool to like show a couple pieces of geometry, and then you put your stuff in them, and then those pieces of geometry are assembled into whatever that bigger composition is. So I don't know. I don't know about that, really. It's what I'm kind of thinking about. So I have a camera over here. Does this work? No. It's not plugged in. That would be the main problem. Typically, you want to plug in your electronics. Not always, but I have found it helpful in my work to plug in electronics. I think I slightly bent the USB port on that. Okay. And now, hello? Did I plug in the wrong thing again? Because that'd be kind of funny. Was that not the right thing? I have too many things over here. This worked yesterday. I'm almost certain. Maybe it didn't. Well, it doesn't help that these have the same... Oh, it's this. Is that the button? I did it! So, what I just kind of want to try, maybe, is... I have to think about this a little bit, because I kind of want to do it with the shader, but I was having trouble with that yesterday. But what I think I want to do... Okay, well, we need to not have that camera here then. I just realized. I just went through the trouble to get that camera active, but if Unity's going to have that camera... Okay, well, the camera works. So, what did we start to do? We started this. And I was trying to do it in the shader. And I was having problems. My shader wasn't working well. And it was a sad story. So let's try what? Let's just try this. This will be sort of our just very first simple prototype of this idea. So what we'd really want is not that. Maybe it is. I kind of want a pentagonal. Yeah, say we just started with a hexagon. And let's say that that hexagon was... Can I not set the forward vector? Maybe 6 is too boring. Maybe we want a higher number. 6 is start. Let's start with 6. Okay. So what we will want to do, I think, is really we just want one face, and then we want the UVs for that face right in the middle. Why are you rotated though? No one should be rotated. we did something like that. Oh, I didn't mean to rename this really. Whatever. Okay. We have a hexagon segment. We have UVs like that. So this, I mean, this feels like it's so simple. So maybe it's a bad idea, but maybe simple's good. I don't know. Hexagon segment, yeah. So instead of this, we probably eventually want to actually figure out how to do the shader-based solution, but you're just tiny. You seem so very tiny. Now you're huge. Okay. And then rotation on Z. Oh, that's not right. What's wrong here? Because it's the wrong place. And then made a segment material. Okay. This might just be too simple. Well, let's try it. So the idea is it's not a kaleidoscope. There's no like reflection or distortion. It's truly just repetition. And I've seen like interesting, you know, like found object mandala. That are just lovely. They're just arrangements of things. That's beautiful. Shoes, stones. Several, Pinterest seems to have a fair number of. That one's nice. They're just arrangements of objects. And sometimes the composition is pretty chaotic, and sometimes the composition is very rigid. But I like that. And so I could imagine just making the segments and then sort of magically sweeping around this special screen. Because I like the reveal. I think the reveal is cool. Like you make your little section and then suddenly suddenly there's a reveal. So let's try it. Let's try, I gotta remember how to webcam it. This is the hexagon camera. I don't know. I already have one. What are you doing? Okay, so I just have to remember how to do this. Can I do it on the shared material? I want a webcam picture. Why? It really seems like a thing you'd want to give an example of, Unity. But I could just cut and paste. Okay, let's just try it. Maybe it's not that complicated. Make a new webcam texture. Let's just try it. The name of the device to be used. That's a problem because I have two devices with the same name. Can I do it with an ID instead? Or maybe it gives me... Okay, this at least gives some code. What are my devices? Actually, I think Unity just like appends a number to it if there's a duplicate device name, I think. Yeah, it would just be this. Okay, so it would be, you would look like this, perhaps? Do I have to give this stuff? What if I don't want to? I don't feel like it. Okay, let's just try it without and let's see what happens. Okay, and then once we have that, we will what? I'm not exactly sure how this will work, but let's see. Just a texture, like a main texture. Yeah. I feel like this is gonna make Unity mad in some way, but let's see. The camera didn't wake up. Maybe that's actually the first camera. Technically, camera 1. But do I have to call play or something? An example would be helpful. Webcam texture. Play. Play. Actually change anything though. It's concerning. Could not start graph. Okay. Maybe it's this camera. No. Oh, maybe because we are in Universal Render Pipeline. Ooh. So, I mean, of course, that's kind of kaleidoscopy. I need some objects. What objects will I put here? A pencil. This flash drive. I'm searching my pockets. I don't have this remote control. This remote control might be too big to change our arrangement here. Strangely, it's my imagination. It feels like there's a lot of distortion on the camera. Maybe it's because these are very close. I would, of course, want this much higher and have a much bigger area. Okay, well, I have to go find some more fun objects to put here. Also, how can I make this camera higher? I don't have a lot of great options. Okay, maybe that's just the height the camera needs to be for the moment. I'm gonna go find some tiny things. I'll be right back. Okay, what are we doing here? I don't know. Mouse cord. Okay, this is too big. I don't like that. So I found a tray that just has lots of objects. Yeah, there's distortion. Maybe it's the webcam texture is just squished a little. Because it's not square. So what is that looks more round, but I don't know where I got that number. I just made it up. That was not big enough. Maybe it is 0.88. there. I've got this green earplug. I've got this sticker. I don't know about the sticker. I've got these 3 screws over here though. So, I mean, here's the thing. I don't want to make a kaleidoscope, and I don't want this to be a kaleidoscope, and I don't want it to be called a kaleidoscope. It's about a composition. A kaleidoscope's about, you know, crazy reflections and other nonsense. But so imagine this. This is all on a semi-interactive table surface. But you just do one at a time. You don't see your repetition at first. You don't see the It's real weird to look at this and try to position on screen. Because the idea would be sort of like, well, you only see this, not that. You only see, you sit down and you make your little arrangement, right? Like you put your stuff down. And this is all the surface you're doing this on is the image surface. And then you push a button or whatever. You do a thing, and then suddenly you see it like this, all sort of cloned around on the same surface where you're placing the objects. I think it's pretty cool, because you start with something like this where it's like, well, okay, it's something. There's nothing, it's like, there's not anything special here. There's nothing, it's a vaguely organized arrangement of objects. This keychain. And it's like, well, whatever. But then when you do the thing, it suddenly has a new meaning to it. And the thing I especially like about this is it, like, the contents and character of it could change so much just based on what you let people put on the surface. Like, it could be nuts and bolts or whatever. Oh, that rolled, and it was kind of cool. It really doesn't want to stay. I mean, to me, there's something kind of magical here of like, well, I got a bunch of nonsense, and then it's kind of doesn't mean anything. And then when you do this, there's something new to it. And of course, there's like kaleidoscopic things where you see that happen in real time. but I like the physical aspect of it too. How could I test this in a more reasonable way? I just need more objects, I think, to start with. I need stuff, and I don't want it to be on wood. I'll be right back. I'll be right back. Oh, it's me. I'm gonna look closer with the camera here. Probably also. Wrong one. What am I doing? I just want to copy. I just was thinking about something else and then just lost my mind a little bit. Okay. Something seems very wrong here. We're just way too close still. Obviously. So you start with just a rectangle, and you get a quarter. This little key ring, and this dime, and this piece of plastic. This screw goes in here. Oh, another piece of plastic goes over here. Let me do this. Because the way I'm imagining this, I mean, when it's just a screen-based thing like this, I'm looking at, like, there's something to this. So if, like, there was a table with a screen embedded in it, and the screen was white, and there was just a black outline, and it said, put stuff in the black outline. And then it saw, then when, based on some trigger or button or something, you push the button and then you see the radial form created from that. And hopefully you don't get these things, these segments, because that's part of what makes it feel really kaleidoscopic. You want them to be really isolated, where it's really just objects. Like, in fact, you might want to try to use computer vision and make a Luma mat or something to try to kind of key them out, or like a difference mat, or maybe some like combination of things like blob detection, whatever. Like, figure out a way to divorce these from their backgrounds so that you didn't have that inconsistency in the background, and then maybe you'd have a little something. And so you put your thing in the square on the screen, and then you'd hit the button, whatever, and then it duplicates around on the screen to complete the whole form. The rest of it, you have your physical objects are still here. Ideally, their virtual objects, the on-screen versions, are directly under it, so then you can remove your objects and have your image. Like, it would be lovely if they lined up perfectly. That seems, I guess it's possible. You figure out some, what's going on with the song? I wasn't even paying attention. Bouzouki Groove. You don't love this song, Jacqueline? That's not your favorite? Like, I kind of want, how could I do this? Like, that's not great, but you start to get the idea of, whoa, whoa, whoa. I mean, the kaleidoscope's fun, it is, but that's not what I want this to be. I'm just trying to get flat lighting. That's relatively flat. That quarter's so dark. Why is that quarter so bright? Like, I feel like I would not want to do this if it feels too kaleidoscopy. I really want it to look like an arrangement of objects. Oh, I know I moved the camera. Wow. You could almost imagine using computer vision and look for round things and then rotate the round things. The white balance ends up being a little nuts, right? Because it's going to be blown out. And it's challenging. It's a tricky problem. I also feel like the camera's not focused properly. I like the surprise more. Jacqueline, what am I doing? The camera just fell over a little bit. I mean, maybe it is cool enough to see it like, if this is on a table and you're truly just placing objects and those objects are seen by all other segments, almost becomes like a collaborative, interactive mandala, sort of. And that's pretty different than what you would normally see. Kind of cool. There's just this round surface and every object you put on it it appeared cloned around itself. That's a bit different than and then when you've made the thing that you like, you push a button and it goes into the world somehow. I think I'm into it. It really would depend on like the camera, like the camera and lighting situation and the screen and all of those things would be very important to get right. Like even this, I feel like I would like this 10 times more if it didn't have those divisions. I feel like just instantly without the divisions, it would be better. think I'm into it. I might be into it. Okay, so what would be the next things we'd want to test? We'd kind of want to have the button. If we did it that way, maybe we don't have the button. Maybe it really is just says like, oh, I put, this screen knows about these sections and it knows that if something appears here, it's going to put it in all of the sections, which is, I can't do that. How could I do that? I couldn't do that. Unless it's like adding up the sections together, but then you'd have stuff on top of. That would be one way for it to work, though. Like additive. I mean, if you had the same stuff in two different places, it would just get kind of ghosted, I guess. You'd want to you wouldn't really want it to be additive if it's just going to end up on white. It's kind of a hard problem. But I think there's something to this. Is that what I would want to do, though? What I want to do, so there's a couple ways. Either there's an outline and there's very specifically, you put stuff in this outline and then you push the button and you see the thing happen, is one way this could go. Or it's like anybody can put anything in any of the sections. And as you do so, those things are like ghosted around. And if something is in the same position in two segments, what do you do then? Like they blend together or something? I don't know why it's having seemingly such autofocus problems. I don't like the additive thing. I mean, there's something kind of nice about that because then multiple people could be working on different pieces, but I think I'd actually just show multiple outlines kind of in different sections. Well, right this minute, I kind of like this more than having to do a bunch of computer vision-y stuff. I do like the surprise, though. I think the surprise is cool. If I call webcam pause, There's probably a way inside this, actually. It is playing. Yeah, I don't need this. So when we get the spacebar, we'll set what was it called? Why aren't you auto-completing? Because we didn't declare this out in the world. If it is playing, pause it. Else, play it. Bend my ear? Yeah, bend it. Please. Please bend my ear. I went out into the world the first time today. I'm kind of scared. I'm a little nervous about it. I went to the museum for a few hours for the first time in months and pretty much stayed totally away from everybody, but like still. Okay, so pausing does let me kind of lock it in. And then unpause lets me go. So I also would want to like hide all the segments. So we could just have like a these are the objects to hide. You're nervous from going to the dumpster? Yeah, I don't know. It's so difficult because I have people that are like, I have friends that go into the world and they're being careful and they're okay, but like I'm still I have some health problems, still on some medication that makes me a little worried about it. Like just a little worried. Okay, what am I looking at here? What are you working on? Is this a logo design or an icon design? An icon for an app? So it's funny because the second thing I got from it was clock. So first, just to talk about like my impressions that I got. The very first thing I thought was there is a check mark and it's inside of a target, like someone is shooting a check mark. And then only after I thought about it a little more did I think, oh, it's kind of a clock, but it's a clock with a check mark checked. Which I think is cool. I like that idea. So this, you know, we've talked a little before about like murder your darlings, and sometimes if design is too clever, like it's not ideal. So like I think my like totally gut immediate reaction is that if the idea was, because there is something to that where it's like, oh, this is my timekeeping app, but it's also the thing that keeps me on target, and it's the thing that lets me check off the things I need to do. I think that's clever. I think it's clever, for sure. But if that's the intention, but I worry a little bit that it's like a little too clever, maybe. Does that make sense? Like that, the fact that I had to think about it for a little while to realize. Usually with a design, if you have to think about it for a little while and you're like, oh, that's clever. It's like a joke, you know, like if someone tells you a joke and then you're like, have to think about it and you're like, oh yeah, that's funny. If the joke, if you don't get the joke in a second, I kind of think that's true for design also. So the fact that it immediately reads to me as a target with a check mark. Thickness, composition, asymmetry. There's so much weight on the, I guess, the check mark, or what would be the dial here. So it's obviously like a little top right heavy, which because compositionally it's a little top right heavy. Again, I don't know. I feel like it really doesn't read as a clock on first glance. So composition-wise, it's not bad, but like if I don't get the clock immediately, it's sort of like, well, why is this icon off in the center instead of being bigger and more? So another question is like, how does it read super small? And I don't know if this is intentional to have these forms different than these forms, if that's just kind of a artifact, but that's a little strange to me that these forms don't match those forms. Oh, am I not going to be able to, like, because it's Imager, they're not going to let me view this small? Let's have a look here. Because if it's an icon, it's going to be tiny, right? Typically. Oops. Are you serious? Is that as small as I can make this? Oh, actually, can we just do this? Okay, that's not bad. There's not a way to do view and then icons and like show the icon size. You can do that in Mac OS, maybe not Windows. That distorts it. You're doing really great, Windows. Okay, looking at this. Still reading pretty strongly as a target to me. So when you look at it at kind of icon size, I think you lose. Yeah, send the SVG, sure. No, you're not taking too much time. Don't worry about it. Let's just look at it. So here's a couple things, just like looking at it at icon size and looking at it at scale, right? A couple things that strike me really quickly. Like these spaces here, they just don't read at all. Like that just doesn't translate. Whoa. Am I hitting the wrong button every single time? Am I doing the wrong operating system shortcuts? Yeah, those spaces. So like, I would probably think like, well, maybe those just don't need to connect, have a space between the edge because it doesn't read at this size. And then it's like, well, maybe they should be shorter. Maybe they should be half height. Maybe there should be more around the edge to really sell that this is a clock. Also, a weird thing, and it's just a weird thing, like this puts the kind of puts the axis of these low from where it would be for a clock. I might also, maybe if I was going to put spaces, I'd put spaces there. Also, Draclin, I don't know what I'm talking about. An important thing to recall. Oops. Wait, did that just place that SVG instead of opening it? Cool. Very cool, Illustrator. Okay. So I'd kind of think that there doesn't really seem to be a reason to me for these to be different. This didn't come through as vector. This is just an image embedded in an SVG, it seems. Is that not true? It seems to be true. Seems like it's just it's a pixel layer, yeah. So, but I would say, I don't see a reason to have these forms be different than these forms. I think that this space is not going to read at icon size. You might be worth putting a space here though, like to break this up a little bit so it's not so heavy in the top right. Just like, you know, like almost like it's a negative stroke, like it'd be white right here. What's the shortcut I want? Why are my shortcuts not working? It's probably my fault. Whatever. I don't... Ugh, leave me alone. How come I can't use Illustrator? Am I in some like weird pen tool mode that's not the real pen tool? Because I'm on this raster layer. Oh, I'm in Photoshop. Of course. I was thinking I was in Illustrator. Falling apart. Okay. But that SVG is not an SVG. It's not vector, right? Am I wrong about that? Or did it just get rasterized when I brought it in Photoshop? Is that what happened? Oh, okay. It was vector. I'm sorry. My mistake. I'm falling to pieces over here. How'd your little friends get so chubby? Did just something weird happen in export when I opened it? So, you know, I feel like these guys could be very slender. I'm not clicking anything that I need to click. They're so robust. I'm never gonna find this. Is that the center? What's this guy look like? How'd you draw this? I see. Well, maybe that kind of thing where you give a little border there. Maybe not, but maybe. But I think that keeping these uniform, I don't know, man, it really looks like a target. Maybe this needs to be tilted a little more so it could come in at that same angle. Maybe maybe these are all a little shorter. Maybe they're dots instead of lines. What do clocks look like? I've never seen a clock. You know, it's funny because like I feel like there's pretty specific analog clock iconography, and I don't know that it often has those rings. No, I mean I don't. But I guess that's my point. Like the target's not bad. It's just maybe a little clever. So maybe there's a way to do it. Like in that case, maybe you lean a little more into a target. I think it's clever. I like the idea of I think a check mark. Okay, here's maybe my problem. Maybe you can't have 3 ideas in it. Maybe that's what the problem is. If it's like, it's a clock, but it's also a check mark, that's clever. Because it's like, oh, this thing keeps you on task and you're going to check your tasks off, right? If it's a clock and it's also a target, I think that's clever. because it's like keeps you on target. I think if it's a kind of a clock and kind of a target and kind of a check mark, it's like a little too much. Like maybe that's what's bothering me, is like it's a little too. That's what I kind of meant by too clever. Like maybe it's a little too clever. I hope that was helpful. So when we play, we do want to hide all these. Is this how this works? Or just the parameter here would be my game object. I never use this syntax, so I just kind of try it. I mean, it's very node looking. We could certainly do this in a more tidy way, but let's just try this for now, just to try the idea. And I'm curious about what's the world of timekeeping icon say. Yeah, I feel like typical clock iconography doesn't have the little sections. I think you have the analog clock language, and sometimes the time it is changes for whatever reason. Sometimes you have this with like a recycle sign. Like here's people at, so yeah, like here's the second idea where it's like it's a clock and it's a like gear, you know, whatever that is, or like this one is maybe what I was thinking more though, of like smaller ticks offset by the bigger ticks. Maybe reads a little more clocky. That one's pretty check marky. That one's not too far. I don't like it as much. I like the shape of your hands a little more than this. The recycle sign thing is a pretty common idea, looks like. Yeah, some of these just feel inelegant. That one's weird. Like the time is just a little bit off. Infinite time. So yeah, if you could find a clever way to resolve the clock and the target, I think that would be cool. Target, clock, icon. So here's people trying to do that. So these targets are more like bullseyes. At a glance, I don't like any of them. Again, maybe they're just a little too clever. Goal met check marks box. This is pretty close to what you have, or like some similar language. Or this is how I read what you had. Like it's a check mark and a target. Which a check mark and a target could be okay too, but then it shouldn't also be a clock, maybe. Something about this. It's not good. The hands aren't good, but there's something about that idea of the ring target like that. Okay. Check mark, clock, icon. Yeah. This I could definitely see, and this has that broken edge I was suggesting. So does this one. So does this one. So does this one. Man, I was just really on point with that broken edge. I actually think I might, there's the Nike swoosh version of the clock hands, but there's the straight version of the clock hands, which maybe I like a little more. I mean, this feels like the language you're in. That one's just, oof, not working. That's pretty close to where you are. It just has those spaces gone. Very material icon, casting the shadow sort of thing. That's really close, just without the whoosh. Yeah, so I guess 2 layers of things. One, I think you need to do a little work just to make it read at small sizes. And then 2, like, think about what you're trying to communicate of those 3 ideas: checkmark, clock, and icon. That one's pretty dang close. I don't love any of these, I must say. Like that one is the target and the check mark, and it's less about, it feels less clocky. Of course, glad to help. Okay, so the idea now is that it doesn't work. The idea is that I broke it because I didn't populate that list. That's why. I need to go pick up a package very shortly, actually. So the idea, yeah, gosh, I'd actually kind of like it if the camera could be, well, because I don't even want the enclosed. I don't want it to be enclosed. That's my problem. I mean, this isn't going to be perfect, but like, it will be far from perfect. But let's just go with it for the moment. Copy you. So this is the version I can mess with, and then when I hit this, I get like, after the fact, I see the kaleidoscopic version. It's not a real-time thing, which I kind of like because something new is revealed to you. Something that wasn't there before. That is maybe the whole idea here. Like the radial symmetry it's more than the sum of its parts, I think. I think there's something to this. I think I like it. It might be crazy to change to this after all the work of procedural geometry. I mean, that's useful work. I can use it for other things. I can maybe use, I kind of want to make 2 artworks now for the museum. Maybe I'll make 3. How crazy would that be? I just make 3 things. If I have too many ideas and I can't cram them all into one thing, how about 3 things? I even kind of like what happens when you just sort of move it. And you could be prompted with different shapes to put things in. I think there's something to this. I think there is. And I could make lots of weird objects out of stuff. In fact, I'm a little curious. You know, I haven't visited, I like Pinocchio, but I haven't been there for a long time. Probably like half Raspberry Pi cases at this point. That's probably an Arduino, but point still stands. Ooh, keyboards. Good for electronics. So like a lot of materials. Yeah, there's like some cool patterns of material. So one idea, I was just having an idea like, oh, I could just have order from Pinocchio a bunch of shapes cut out of a bunch of materials. And then I wouldn't have to source all those materials and do all the cuts, you know, like they... So there's all these categories. I see. So there's plastics, which I assume are acrylics. Oh, there's foam. Black coated MDF. Well, this is not. I feel like they could have picked a nicer example for this. Okay, so that's like etching. Yeah, I don't know about the look and feel. I like the herringbone MDF. I think it's funny. Man, there's a lot of stuff. They've got a lot of materials, which is cool. I don't know how this stuff holds up. Would be a fear. So they have woods, they have plastics, cardboards, textiles. Funny that they call leather a textile. I mean, that's probably right, but it feels weird. Lots of felt. Okay. I like things with some texture to them. It's harder to clean. Rubber, photochemical. Okay, so what do we have in our plastic realm? There's a lot of plastics. We probably don't want anything real reflective because it's just like, if it's super reflective, it'll just reflect the camera. And that's not cool. Glitter acrylic. It's funny that it's like, it's from 15 cents, but for how little? It's pretty. Yes. Upload my design. Presumably I have a Pinocchio account from 100 years ago. But I also kind of think it's cool if people can just put stuff. If people just put pennies and stuff that's in their pockets. I think it's pretty cool. Okay, so where might I have put that? Well, what do we have? We have a circle that we made yesterday. We have a very important circle. Within our vector studies. So the camera calibration is a thing that worries me a little. Because to do this perfectly, and I probably have yet to describe this idea well, but the idea being you go up, there's this surface that's illuminated. It's really a screen underneath, and it's got a rectangle on it. It'll be outlined in black, say. And somewhere there'll be instructions that says, place objects in the rectangle, or in the triangle, And you'll place your objects and you'll make your little arrangement. Whatever the objects are, whatever the arrangement is. Like, let's just have, I'm gonna shake this up and make a little mess. Here's my messy little arrangement after a tiny earthquake. And then once I have my arrangement, I press the button and I see it cloned. But the idea is one of these is me still looking down at my literal actual objects that I was looking at, and then they're just duplicated around the edge. And it's like, it's actually a pretty simple thing, which is maybe what worries me a little, is the simplicity of it. But I can imagine making it more interesting and more complicated, and having, you know, parts that other people do get mixed and matched. Like, say I take this and then there's some display on the wall that's mixing everybody's, and it does one where these three pieces are from one person and these three pieces are from another person. What does that composition look like? Like, it starts to assemble these things that are made, that everybody's contributed over time. And maybe some of them get really intense. Maybe some of them are like, is from Islamic tiling patterns. You know, you could kind of imagine having at some point prompting someone to, you know, you're going to fill what's in this square, and it makes a small version and it's cool. But then over time, everybody's contributed all of these shapes, and it makes some crazy composition, some beautifully complex composition. Or even things like this, where it's one's in the center and then somebody else's is arranged around the edge like that. And I just think I think there's something to it. Whoa. Cool. What is this? It's made of software? Okay. And again, like, the idea would be, as much as possible in that scenario, to get rid of these. You wouldn't see the boundaries or the changing. So it's not kaleidoscopic. You don't see like the fractured aspect of it. You just see the repeated objects. Is that a bad idea? Is it a good idea? It's an idea. And I think I'm kind of into it. So I can be like, here's my pencil and my 2 coins. And this circle, and this circle. And this black thing, and this black thing. What do you want to put? If I could line this up perfectly. Okay, I don't, yeah, that's kind of a bummer. I don't actually like it when it becomes distorted or kaleidoscopic. I want it to be the object. So people can do that, and they will do it, probably. I just bumped the camera. Very exciting. Yeah, the camera would want to always clear the virtual version before doing, yeah, of course. Yeah, that duplicated version just doesn't work, because if the camera's looking at stuff, it's going to see the screen. So you end up with like a weird feedback loop if you're... trying to do that live on top of the surface you're using. You couldn't do that. You need the capture, which is fine because I think I prefer the capture, I think. Jacqueline, are you there? Is anybody there? Is this a bad idea? Is this okay? Like, I think I like it. We did a lot of computer graphics work. There may still be some computer vision here. There's certainly some computer composition kinds of work, but I kind of want to know if I could do, could I reliably do, let's see. What the heck was that? Okay. Photoshop. And this music is so calming. Maybe this Life is Yours was maybe is right. I just needed calming. Where would that file be? Where could it be? Here? Yes. So like, no. Bad job. Very blurry. Trying to see what it's like if it's just the objects. That too boring? Oh no, I moved it. Oh no. Why is it so? Not focusing well. Why? Okay, you almost focused and then you went past it. Shoot, I hit the wrong button. It doesn't help that it's blurry. We're casting shadows. I mean, the mask was kind of cool. Uh-oh. Did you just crash for no reason? What just happened? That was weird. The outline's kind of nice. That didn't work. Oh. What? That is the right shortcut, that one. Okay, the image is blurry, of course. funny because maybe I do actually want the border. Maybe I was wrong about that.
Our struggle as artists isn't about appeasing the crowd. Rather, it's about tending to the broken parts inside of ourselves. We create things as a reflection.
Okay, you need to illuminate it really evenly. I guess if the screen is white and not super bright, it'll help the...
That wave isn't necessarily a thing you achieve. Rather, it is a state of mind which you constantly strive toward.
Okay, well,
From an understanding that ideas aren't static.
this little example helps.
Water,
It doesn't look great, but it's hard to tell if it's like because the idea is bad or because the image quality is so bad. You know what I mean? That as much as I kind of don't want to admit it, I feel like the kaleidoscopic shading does help. Also, kind of lame that this doesn't let you put something in the middle. I mean, you can get close, but as far as like having something dead center, you can't really do that with this this approach. What? I'm imagining making it like pie wedge circular instead of what? Okay, I've got to think more about this. There's definitely something about it I like, for sure. I'm liking the idea of a table that you can sit around and do something with real objects. That part, I'm pretty into. Everything else I don't know about. I'm not sure. Okay. I've got more things to do. I just wanted to try this, like, think about this alternate path a little bit and see. There's something to it. It's just like, how do I make it look good and how do I make the process good? Like, how to make the experience of using it good. So, anyway, thanks for hanging out, and we will stream again tomorrow and figure out something else to work on. Something, right? Probably. Bye.